Okay, so good evening, whatever time it is, to those who may be listening, or to myself who may be listening in the future. We're going to continue here talking about Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Today, as I said, is evening, and like many evenings, I'm often subject to the unfortunate nature of our reality, of our human existence, and that is fatigue and exhaustion. And yet I find a certain inspiration from the depth, from the wellspring of life that invigorates me, that pulls me away from the sleep, from the rest, from the break, and back into the world of work and labor. And so he begins, in almost every article of defense we abound. Hemp flourishes even to rankness, so that we need not want cordage. So again, Thomas Paine is talking about the abundance of American resources. We just got done talking about England's Navy, and that they have many ships within their arsenals, but they are spread thin due to their commitments abroad, due to their colonies that they possess. And within this abundance of resources in the land of North America, hemp flourishes even to rankness, so that we need not want cordage. Our iron is superior to that of other countries. Our small arms equal to any in the world. Cannon we can cast at pleasure. Saltpeter and gunpowder we are every day producing. Our knowledge is hourly improving. Resolution is our inherent character, and courage has not yet forsaken us. Wherefore, what is it that we want? Why is it that we hesitate? From Britain we can expect nothing but ruin. If she is once admitted to the government of America again, this continent will not be worth living in. Jealousies will be always arising. Insurrections will be constantly happening. And who will go forth to quell them? Who will venture his life to reduce his own countrymen to a foreign obedience? The difference between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, respecting some unlocated lands, shows the insignificance of a British government, and fully proves that nothing but continental authority can regulate continental matters. So, I like this sentence here. Resolution is our inherent character, and courage has not yet forsaken us. And so if we think about resolution, it's a firm commitment to a certain end. It's a belief. It's a faith. And this resolution is inherent in our character. And courage, something that stands in the face of uncertainty, in the face of temptation, is the very through line which we can tether our resolution to our external reality. In other words, to bring our divine, our perception of the divine into, perhaps I should say, for us to have the capacity to receive divine insight through courage, or I should say through resolution, and through courage, through standing tall and forthrightedly, we can meet the end that we desire. And so he says, this has not yet been forsaken. Wherefore, what is it that we want? What is the end? If we are to stand tall and we are resolute, where does this lead us? Why is it that we hesitate? And in this sentence in my mind, I think, why is it that we hesitate? It's because of faltering of courage. Because true courage, there would be no hesitation. From Britain, we can expect nothing but ruin. If she is once admitted to government of America again, this continent will not be worth living in. And so, it's this very resolution against England that opens this portal. This is why the American Revolution is so fascinating to me. Because there are certain periods in history in which the divine opens a portal for us to see. And we can analogize it to the Platonic cave, moving from a state of blindness or low resolution to a state of high resolution, in which what is becomes absolutely apparent to us. And although we may hesitate, our courage may falter, what is resolute will lead us to a certain type of salvation. Who will venture his life to reduce his own countrymen to afford an obedience? The difference between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, respecting some unlocated lands, shows the insignificance of a British government, and fully proves that nothing but continental authority can regulate continental matters. Another reason why the present time is preferable to all others is that the fewer our numbers are, the more land there is yet unoccupied, which instead of being lavished by the king on his worthless dependents, may hereafter applied not only to the discharge of the present debt, but to the constant support of government. No nation under heaven has such an advantage as this. So let's break this down a little bit. So, another reason why the present time is preferable to all others is that the fewer our numbers, perhaps the fewer citizens, the fewer colonists, the fewer Americans, the more land there is yet unoccupied. That means there is room. There's room to expand. There's room for more numbers, which instead of being lavished by the king on his worthless dependents, may be hereafter not only to the discharge of the present debt, but to the constant support of government. No nation under heaven has had such an advantage as this. And so when he says, of course, the land is not for the king to lavish his worthless dependents, but it is to not only to the discharge of the present debt, in other words, the growth of our people, of Americans, into this land will not only go to the discharge of the present debt, for which we take on to fight the tyrannical force of England, but to the constant support of the very government that will protect us from future tyrannies. and to support our law and our unity. No nation under heaven has had such an advantage as this. The infant state of the colonies, as it is called, so far from being against, is an argument in favor of independence. We are sufficiently numerous, and were we more so, we might be less united. It is a matter worthy of observation that the more a country is peopled, the smaller their armies are. In military numbers, the ancients far exceeded the moderns. And the reason is evident, for trade being the consequence of population, men became too much absorbed thereby to attend to anything else. Commerce diminishes the spirit both of patriotism and military defense. And history sufficiently informs us that the bravest achievements were always accomplished in the non-age of a nation. With the increase of commerce of England has lost its spirit. The city of London, notwithstanding its numbers, submits to continued insults with the patience of a coward. The more men have to lose, the less willing they are to venture. The rich are in general slaves to fear, and submit to courtly power with the trembling duplicity of a spaniel. So here's another interesting paragraph that we're going to break down. So he says the infant colonies, the sort of newborn, as it is called, so far from being against the idea of independence, is the very argument in its favor. We are sufficiently numerous, and we are more so, were we more so, we might be less united. So that's an interesting reflection. The reason in this statement here is that as the numbers of a people grow, the less united they become. And so why does he say this? It is a matter of worthy observation that the more a country is peopled, the smaller their armies are. Which would be an interesting thing, which is an interesting observation, because you might expect that a country that is more populous would naturally have a larger army, because they have more men to supply their armed forces. They have more property, let's say, to protect. In military numbers, the ancients far exceeded the moderns. And the reason is evident, for trade being the consequence of population. In other words, as the population increases, trade increases. Men became too much absorbed thereby to attend to anything else other than commerce. And history sufficiently informs us that the bravest achievements were always accomplished in the non-age of a nation. So in other words, that is to say, trade is something that is the consequence of population. That is, as population grows, trade increases. And so he continues here. Men became too much absorbed thereby to attend to anything else other than trade. Commerce diminishes the spirit of both patriotism and military defense. And history sufficiently informs us that the bravest achievements were always accomplished in the non-age of a nation. So the bravest achievements are accomplished in a non-age. And so what does it mean for a nation to be of an age or in an age? In my opinion, for a nation to be of an age is for it to be at its technological height, let's say, its peak prosperity. And again, he says, and history sufficiently informs us that the bravest, this is the key word here, bravest achievements were always accomplished in the non-age of a nation. So I'm guessing that these achievements were the bravest achievements were the very ones that allowed the age of a nation to occur. And of course this has to happen in a non-age because the conditions, the substrate, in order to grow the material to create this prosperous life has to occur before the age itself. With the increase of commerce, England has lost its spirit. Now, what a critique is that? To say something has lost its spirit is quite a harsh critique. Now, how many of us, individuals, can say that we've ever lost our spirit? If there are any unfortunate few that can say that they have, this is a terrible thing, a dreadful thing, one of an existential nature. The City of London, notwithstanding its numbers, submits to continued insults with the patience of a coward. The more men have to lose, the less willing they are to venture. So, the less willing they are to venture, the more they have to lose. Why might this be? They have more. They've put what means something to them into material objects. And to lose and to place our meaning, our purpose, into material things, into commerce, let's say, when these things are taken from us, we feel robbed of something. Although it might not be right, in the ideal sense, we should be placing our meaning, our purpose, our desires into the divine sorts of things, into the finer sorts of things, into beauty, into goodness, into love. Of course, these are a bit abstract. These are not material things. These are immaterial things. These are things of a divine nature. And yet, it is a common pattern in the behavior of men that the more that they have in this sort of material sense, it could even be in an immaterial sense. I mean, if we have built a family and a stable environment for them, we certainly do have more as well. So there are more than one side. There's more than one side to this coin, and so certainly we'd be less willing to venture if we have a family. If something happens to us, then our family would be left wanting, and certainly in that sense, it would prohibit somebody from pursuing or venturing. The rich are in general slaves to fear, and submit to courtly power with the trembling duplicity of a spaniel. And of course, we see this duality again, because the rich will have both an increase in material prosperity, but also an increase in this substrate, or the probability for producing a family in such a light as to be in jeopardy or vulnerable to infection, because something of such a rich character, of such a rich nature, is elevated to such a height that it has stored potential. As you can imagine, in a physical object, as you raise it above your head, has much more potential energy than one that is at rest at the ground or on the ground. And so because of this fear of losing, they submit. They are slaves to fear. They fear the very thing that can take it from them. Youth is the seed time of good habits, as well in nations as in individuals. It might be difficult, if not impossible, to form the continent into one government half a century from now. So he says, again, youth is the seed time of good habits. A bit of an unfortunate statement in my mind, because youth eventually fades. And what does it mean for youth to fade? If this is the seed time of good habits, what if we pass our seed time and yet we still are committed to developing good habits? Is it too late? Certainly not in the individual sense. And if it applies in the individual sense, I can't imagine that it would not apply for nations as well. And so when I think about our modern context, the type of change that would be required to produce a seed time would be a certain return to youthfulness. And this return to youthfulness is immaterial, in a sense, because we're not returning to a state of stronger muscles, stronger bones, perhaps in the sense of the individual, if they want to change their habits, if they want to change their life. But they are returning to a youthful state of mind, an openness to change, perhaps out of necessity. And in the same way, this can happen to a nation. And in some sense, a nation is much more pliable, is much more malleable than an individual. But again, once we remove the material explanation, it opens an entire reality of possibility, of change, of potential. The vast variety of interests occasioned by an increase of trade and population would create confusion. Colony would be against colony. Each being able might scorn each other's assistance, and while the proud and foolish gloried in their little distinctions, the wise would lament that the union had not been formed before. So, he says, the vast variety of interests, the multiplicity of interests, occasioned by an increase of trade and population, so this is a projection into the future, would create confusion. And why might this be the case? Because there is no unity. If there is unification of interest, there would be no confusion. But if interests are atomized, they pull in all sorts of different directions. And this would pit, then, colony against colony, because there is no unity. There is just the atomization, the freedom of interest. Each being able might scorn each other's assistance, and while the proud and foolish gloried in their little distinctions, the wise would be upset, they would be disappointed, they would lament that the union had not been formed before. Because without this union, the interest creates a multiplicity, a state of confusion and conflict. Wherefore, the present time is the true time for establishing it. The intimacy which is contracted in infancy, and the friendship which is formed in misfortune, are of all others the most lasting and unalterable. Our present union is marked with both these characters. We are young, and we have been distressed, but our concord has withstood our troubles, and fixes a memorable era for posterity to glory in. So in other words, we have the perfect substrate. We are insulted by the tyranny of England, and our colonies are young. the very process of atomization has not corrupted our souls, has not pulled us into many different directions. As one might walk down a path that continues time and further distance, we can imagine if many people take different paths and we let it go, a web of separation will begin to exist. The distance between the individuals will increase, and the chances for unity thereby will decrease, because in time, even the loudest appeal for union will not be heard by other potential members because of the very distance that they have traveled in pursuit of their own interests. The present time, likewise, is that particular time which never happens to a nation but once, namely, the time of forming itself into a government. Most nations have let slip the opportunity, and by that means have compelled to receive laws from their conquerors, instead of making laws for themselves. First they had a king, and then a form of government, whereas the articles or charter of government should be formed first, and men delegated to execute them afterwards. But from the errors of other nations, let us learn wisdom, and lay hold of our present opportunity to begin government at the right end. So now is a particular time, a unique time of a fertile substrate in which we can form a government, because we have no government. Well, technically we do. We have a tyrannical government that's over us, but this new thing that has detached itself from that tyrannical mother, let's say, and I know that there are problems with that distinction, as we have talked about earlier, but this new thing, this new child, this new body of men has the opportunity of forming itself into a government, whereas many before them were subject to the tyranny of a king at their inception. So he says that many nations have let slip the opportunity of forming their own government, and that have given way to their conquerors, for their conquerors to make the laws, instead of they themselves making the laws. And he says, first they had a king, and then a government was formed. Whereas the articles of a charter of government, again, the very wellspring of principles, or this document in which a representative body has come together to outline the principles and the ideas which are to define a new body, to bring into, a new type of unity. So again, he says, whereas the articles of a charter of government should be formed first, and men delegated to execute them afterwards. But from the errors of other nations, let us learn wisdom, and lay hold of the present opportunity to begin government at the right end, and that is to establish it first, under the consent of the governed, and not have it be this top-down, man-made tyranny. Let man emerge, let man expand his base, so that he may receive the gift of heaven. Is essentially how I see this. The emergent nature of man, of man's collective consciousness, is more apt to receive the emanatory divine will than his individual, whether it be purely the individual and the individual soul, or an individual in terms of a king, or of a tyrant, or something of this nature, or of a pope, let's say. When William the Conqueror subdued England, he gave them law at the point of the sword. And until we consent that the seat of government in America be legal and authoritatively occupied, we shall be in danger of having it filled by some fortunate ruffian who may treat us in the same manner, and then where will be our freedom? Where will be our property? So exactly, it's this inability of the collective. In a certain sense, this is the formation of a giant. If we talk about the head that is insufficient to hold the body, this can be a form of giant, I feel like. Or it could be the other way around. It could be that the body, or that the head rather, is too large for the body. But in the case of the kingship, the head is too small for the body. And so, given this unitary consciousness that is man, right? Because there's nothing per se wrong with the union, but it is this union that is sub-divine, that is within the power of man, that is inherently limiting. And again, I just discussed that this emergent wellspring is the thing, and the only thing, that can catch the divine inspiration. Of course, it can fail due to atomism and the things that we just discussed about the varying degrees of interests that are in no way out of our own understanding in the modern context. America today is completely atomistic. How there has not been a war from within our country is baffling to me. That's not to say that it won't happen. It's not to say that it will happen, but it is very interesting that we are held together so tightly still in the face of such atomization. I think that really gives tribute to the strength of the institutions that were designed by our forefathers. Now, of course, they can't stand up to everything. They can crumble, and they can erode, and they can collapse. But so far, they've held, fortunately for us. As to religion, I hold it to be the indispensable duty of all governments to protect all conscientious professors thereof. And I know of no other business which government has to do therewith. Let a man throw aside that narrowness of soul, that selfishness of principle, which the niggards of all professions are so unwilling to part with, and he will be at once divided of his fears on that head. Suspicion is the companion of mean souls, and the bane of all good society. For myself, I fully and conscientiously believe that it is the will of the Almighty that there should be a diversity of religious opinions among us. It offers a larger field for our Christian kindness. Were we all of one way of thinking, our religious dispositions would want matter for probation. And on this liberal principle, I took on the various denominations among us to be like children of the same family, differing only in what is called their Christian names. Okay, so this is a particularly interesting paragraph. He says, as to religion, I hold it to be the indispensable duty of all governments to protect all conscientious professors thereof. So the well-meaning people, the people who wish to do their duty well, who are faithful. This is the responsibility of government, is to protect these people. to protect their right to profess their faith. Let a man throw aside that narrowness of soul, that selfishness of principle, which the niggards of all profession are so unwilling to part with. In other words, all of these stingy people, these selfish people, let them throw aside all of that. And once he does that, he will at once be delivered of his fears on that head. Suspicion is the companion of mean souls and the bane of all good society. So I'd like to pause here and to reflect on liberalism, which he mentions. I can certainly imagine a case in which a particular type of religious thought is destructive to the whole. Even in such a case, though, it is the government's responsibility to protect their right to do it, because the only thing that can surmount it is not tyranny, is not the authority of man over another. It is the truth of the matter. Even if it is forced, even if the truth is forced into the darkest of corners of our existence, the greater the pressure against our most cherished understandings, the greater it will burst forth and flood the surrounding landscape and into the eyes of man, into his mind, into his soul, into his heart. And so, although almost irresistible for government to be involved in such ideological crusades, it is their prerogative to remain independent of this struggle. It is for the people to struggle with themselves, not for some institutional bureaucracy to get wound up in it. For myself, I fully and conscientiously believe that it is the will of the Almighty that there should be a diversity of religious opinions among us. It affords a larger field for our kindness as Christians. And this, in some sense, gets back to what I was saying about the creating the base for which to accept divine authority. Because within this larger field, it affords our Christian kindness. And in that statement, our Christian kindness is a very packed statement, even though it might not seem so at first glance. But what it means for us to have a collective Christian kindness is quite substantial. Christianity is a very large tradition with a very many, with a large volume of books, not only biblical, but also the traditions that run through the saints and through the various metaphysical and philosophical explorations of mankind. There's a lot into that statement. It is the very heart of our culture. And it is within the diversity of religious opinions that affords us to spread this cultural tradition and heritage. Even, like I said, if it faces death from another. If it is true, it surely will not die. And even if it, as Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher says that God is dead. Even if God is to truly die in the hearts and in the minds of man, the divine principle will come back, and it will reinvigorate mankind. It may not be in the way that we want. It may find us through the arms of evil, through the evil spirit, through the devil. But eventually, that will get worked through us and out of us through the higher principle. And the true nature will flood in. It doesn't necessarily have to be as extreme as the second coming, or it could be. But it does involve a new transmission of divine authority into the hearts and minds of man. And this could be a prophet of some sort. But again, this is a digression. This is assuming that, sort of reflecting on the current state of our society and the predicament that we find ourselves in. This is sort of in that vein. Were we all of one way of thinking, our religious dispositions would want matter for probation. And on this liberal principle, I look on the various denominations among us to be like children of the same family, differing only in what is called their Christian names. I wonder what he would say now. Because many of us are no longer Christian, and many Christians are only Christian in the nominal sense. Much of the rich grounding and cultural heritage is lost. And what it once was a very traditional society, a society that could be considered to be under the same umbrella, the same family, is now this sort of distorted community of ragtag, different families and broken homes, broken houses. Perhaps that's too pessimistic. In page 151, I threw out a few thoughts on the propriety of a continental charter, for I only presume to offer hints, not plans. And in this place, I take the liberty of re-mentioning the subject by observing that a charter is to be understood as the bond of solemn obligation, which the whole enter into to support the right of every separate part, whether of religion, personal freedom, or property. A firm bargain and a right reckoning make long friends. This is the unfortunate thing about liberalism, is for the sheer opportunity for heaven and for the sheer opportunity of hell. But so it is with human existence. And this is what I think about when I hear him say, by observing that a charter is to be understood as a bond of solemn obligation, which the whole enters into. So the whole enters into for the primary purpose to support the right of every part, whether of religion, personal freedom, or property. And in the case of a virus, like we are seeing now, what then? We must support it, shouldn't we? In a sense. But it's not until that virus begins to corrupt our institutions and turn the very institutions that were meant to protect us and our freedom of thought and opinion, that we then begin to see the dangers of blindness, perhaps, of not being able to see beyond new religious or ideological conception. And it's within the birth of anew, and this homogeneity of thought, of virality, that is very dangerous to the very structure and foundations of the system that allows for it to happen in the first place. So, I'm not sure what the answer to these difficulties are, but it's just merely an observation. I have heretofore likewise mentioned the necessity of a large and equal representation, and there is no political matter which more deserves our attention. A small number of electors, or a small number of representatives, are equally dangerous. But if the number of representatives be not only small, but unequal, the danger is increased. As an instance of this, I mention the following. When the Associators' petition was before the House Assembly of Pennsylvania, 28 members only were present. All the Bucks County members, but 8, voted against it, and had 7 of the Chester members done the same, this whole province had then been governed by only 2 counties. And this danger it is always exposed to. So let us rewind here. And so he says he's mentioned the importance of having a large and equal representation. And this is the political matter that is of utmost importance, of representation, of how this body is to be represented. And he says a small number of electors or small number of representatives are equally dangerous. Because if the number is insufficiently large to represent us, represent the citizens of a united body, then we run the risk of, first and foremost, I would say corruption. That is to say, the fewer number that there are to represent a larger number of individuals, the more power that they have, and the more likely they are, if they are to be corrupted, the larger the effect of that corruption will be. But if the number of representatives be not only small, but unequal, the danger is increased. And then he goes into this instance in which you have a petition before the House of Assembly in Pennsylvania. You have 28 members were present. And you have the members of Bucks County, 8 of those 28, voting against. And had 7 of the Chester members done the same, this whole province had then been governed by 2 counties only. And certainly in a province there would be much more than 2 counties. And this danger it is always exposed to. The unwarrantable stretch, likewise, which that House made in their last sitting to gain an undue authority over the delegates of that province, ought to warn the people at large how they trust power out of their own hands. A set of instructions for their delegates were put together, which in point of sense and business would have dishonored a schoolboy, and after being approved of by a very few, without doors, were carried into the House, and there passed in behalf of the whole colony. Whereas, did the whole colony know that with what ill will that House had entered on some necessary public measures, they would not hesitate a moment to think them unworthy of such a trust. So in other words, there must be safeguards against the few, the very few, without doors. In other words, closed to opposing views. There must be a way to prevent them from passing legislation on behalf of the whole colony without proper debate, without proper representation. Because, he says, if the whole colony knew that this bill and the ill will that had entered on some necessary public measure, they would not hesitate a moment to think them unworthy of such a trust. And there we will stop for today. Okay, so we are going to continue here with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Immediate necessity makes many things convenient, which if continued would grow into oppressions. So immediate necessity, that is, I need this now. I need this to be done now. Of course, the immediate necessity of things, the on-demand pleasure, the simple access to information in the modern context, makes many things convenient. It's easy to order something on Amazon. It's easy to open up my iPad and watch something quite profound and quite intricate for free. But if this is continued, it would grow into oppression. Expedience and right are different things. When the calamities of America required a consultation, there was no method so ready, or at that time so proper, as to appoint persons from the several houses of assembly for that purpose. And the wisdom with which they have proceeded has preserved this continent from ruin. But as it is more than probable that we shall never be without a Congress, every well-wisher to good order must own that the mode for choosing members of that body deserves consideration. And I put it as a question to those who make a study of mankind, whether representation and election is not too great a power for one and the same body of men to possess. Whenever we are planning for posterity, we ought to remember that virtue is not hereditary. So, we see continued poetry here in my mind from Mr. Paine. And so what can we get from this? Expedience and right are different things. And what shortage is there in our modern society of expedience? What is not more clear than the expedience of our modern institutions, of our corporate bodies, of our economic enterprise, of the pursuit of modern happiness? These things may be practical, in a sense. These pursuits may be perceived as practical. And yet, what lies beneath them? What lies beneath the man that pursues the managerial position for nothing other than a paycheck, for a degree of status in society, for an end that is lower than the highest of ends? This man is given to expedience. Of course, this expedience, in a sense, is amoral, because it is off base. It doesn't reach for the heavens. It reaches for what is easiest, the lowest hanging fruit. And right is something that is entirely different. So in everything that happened in the American Revolution, of all of the unfortunate realities that they found themselves face to face with, the promise of a bright future seemingly taken from them by a totalitarian state and dated totalitarian institutions. Perhaps I shouldn't say dated. Totalitarian institutions and the spirit of evil are perennial problems of man. But as America has found itself in that position in its relationship with England, it required a consultation, a coming together. And the method by which they had done so was to gather those from the several houses of assembly and the wisdom of those members that came together has preserved this continent from ruin. It preserved a union, a particular type of union, a union that saw in the face of its calamities the true face of liberty in the age that they found themselves in. And he continues to say, but as it is more than probable that we shall never be without a Congress, every well-wisher to good order must own that the mode of choosing members of that body deserves consideration, the utmost consideration. Because what is this nation, this newfound nation, a body that has survived its calamities, if it is only to be usurped again by an improper method, a method of expedience, rather than by right. And I put it as a question to those who make a study of mankind, whether representation and election is not too great a power for one and the same body of men to possess. And he poses that as a question. Of course, I cannot answer this question. Whenever we are planning for posterity, we ought to remember that virtue is not hereditary. And of course, virtue is moral standing. It is high moral standing. And it is not within our blood, within the simple nature of our reality that decides virtue. It is more of the refined nature, the human nature, the divine inspiration that decides our virtues. It is from our enemies that we often gain excellent maxims, and are frequently surprised into reason by their mistakes. Mr. Cornwall, one of the Lords of the Treasury, treated the petition of the New York Assembly with contempt. Because that House, he said, consisted but of 26 members, which trifling number, he argued, could not with decency be put for the whole. We thank him for his involuntary honesty. So, although Mr. Cornwall, not necessarily a friend to the United States or to the American colonists, gave them a bit of wisdom about representation. To conclude, however strange it may appear to some, however unwilling they may be to think so, matters not, but many strong and striking reasons may be given to show that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence, some of which are, first, it is the custom of nations, when any two are at war, or some other powers, not engaged in a quarrel, to step in as mediators and bring about the preliminaries of a peace. But while America calls herself the subject of Britain, no power, however well disposed she may be, can offer her mediation. Wherefore, in our present state, we may quarrel on forever. And I know that he perhaps means a certain type of mediation by another nation, but I can't help but to reflect and make a cheeky remark about the French involvement in our revolution. Secondly, he says, it is unreasonable to suppose that France or Spain will give us any kind of assistance, if we mean only to make use of that assistance for the purpose of repairing the breach and strengthening the connection between Britain and America, because those powers would be sufferers by the consequences. Thirdly, while we profess ourselves the subjects of Britain, we must, in the eyes of foreign nations, be considered as rebels. The precedent is somewhat dangerous to their peace. For men to be in arms under this name of subjects, we, on the spot, can solve the paradox. But to unite resistance and subjection requires an idea much too defined for common understanding. So this third reason here for the Declaration of Independence I find to be one that deserves some reflection. So while we are under the subjection of Great Britain, we must, in the eyes of other nations, be considered as rebels. Because what is happening now is dangerous to those nations and the peace of those nations. For men to be in arms under the name of subjects, that is, the people under the authority of a governing body, for them to be up in arms, for them to actively want to dissolve that union, we on the spot can solve the paradox. But to unite resistance and subjection requires an idea much too refined for common understanding. And here in my mind I think of the French Revolution. And how unfortunate was that circumstance. I've mentioned it on other episodes, but as I reflect on it here, it comes up over and over and over again. The American Revolution is as such a dramatic story as the French, even though the outcomes are quite different. And of course, in the case of the French Revolution, they they desired the same types of liberties as the Americans fought for, and yet they were unable to handle the burdens that they were unleashing upon their own shoulders. And of course, in the 19th century, they fell into despotism under the Emperor Napoleon, a despot who tried to conquer the whole of Europe and nearly succeeded. Fourthly, were a manifesto to be published and dispatched to foreign courts, setting forth the miseries we have endured and the peaceful methods which we have ineffectually used for redress, declaring at the same time that not being able any longer to live happily or safely under the cruel disposition of the British court, we have been driven to the necessity of breaking off all connection with her, at the same time assuring all such courts of our peaceable disposition towards them, and of our desire of entering into trade with them. Such a memorial would produce more good effects to this continent than if a ship were freighted with petitions to Britain. In other words, we cannot let just as in the previous example that he puts forth, we cannot let this precedent and the rebellion of the subject fool other nations into believing that this is a disunity. We are very much together in this, and by formally coming into contact with them, by formally writing a manifesto, dispatching it to their foreign courts, explaining their redresses, and that they cannot live no longer can live happily as subjects under this authority, then perhaps they can establish a different type of union, a union between two different bodies. To continue, under our present denomination of British subjects, we can neither be received nor heard abroad. The custom of all courts is against us, and will be so, until, by an independence, we take rank with other nations. In other words, they are not perceived as a body in and of themselves. They are perceived as part of the body of England. And so therefore, the hereditary authority, the tyranny of the English monarchy, is the body that communicates with other nations. They are, in a sense, the representative body of America, of the colonists. These proceedings may at first appear strange and difficult, but like all other steps which we have already passed over, will in a little time become familiar and agreeable, and until an independence is declared, the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, and yet knows it must be done. Hates to set it about, wishes it over, and is continually haunted with the thoughts of its necessity. And perhaps we will stop there for today.